What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Fully Inflated Football Podcast. So we're going to do things a little differently to start this thing off. This is going to be a little bit of a hybrid YouTube podcast intro here. We are going to just start off with my main topic for the show. I want to thank Peak Byron on Twitter for bringing this topic in. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you catch the rest of this podcast. It will be uploaded on Spotify. It's the Fully Inflated Football Podcast. But this is something I want to kind of get on the record here of why I say for a lot of teams, 4-3 is a better deal for your defense than a 3-4. There's a lot of reasons I think that. I wanted to just kind of collect my thoughts on this, put it down on the record. So when people ask, why do you say that? There's all these great 3-4 teams. I can kind of lay this all out so you guys know what I'm talking about, where I'm coming from when I say that. So there's definitely some parameters I need to talk about with this argument. First is that I'm not really talking about your base 3-4 or your base 4-3 defenses like you'd see in 2008 or in Madden. You know, in 2020, nickel is the new base. Outside of like the Seattle Seahawks last year, whose third linebacker, Michael Kendricks, just happened to be faster and better in coverage than their third corner, Ugo Amadi, or whoever they wanted to go with. Every team in the NFL is running nickel defenses as their base defense, coming out in nickel packages 60% of the time at a minimum, up to 85+% of the time for some teams. So if you aren't familiar, nickel defense is 2 interior defensive linemen, 2 edge rushers, 2 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. So when I say that teams should be 4-3 over 3-4, it's really more about the overall philosophy of those schemes over like the personnel of the actual teams. Though I will say there are reasons that personnel in a 4-3, especially in the front 7, is much easier to find the personnel than in a 3-4. And I'll talk about that a little bit later here. But at its core, the 3-4 scheme is an aggressive blitz and disguise scheme designed to, come from different angles, encourage versatility within the players, and confuse offenses. And when this works, it really works. And many of you are probably thinking like, well, some of the best defenses over the last 5 years, the Broncos, the Bears, the Steelers last year, the Ravens, great defenses, championship caliber defense. Absolutely. There are definitely circumstances where when run correctly with the right personnel, when you get the right personnel in place, a 3-4 defense can actually have a higher ceiling and make a ton of sense for teams who have potential to win a championship off of their defense. But for a 4-3 scheme, this tends to be much more of a bend, don't break approach. They're going to blitz, but mostly going to rely on pressure from their front 4, limiting the amount of plays and assignments that everyone on the back end must be responsible for so that players can play fast, not have broken coverages, lead to chunk plays, all that bad stuff that really leads to bad defenses, like bottom 5, bottom 10 defenses. And that's the heart of my argument right there. As many of you guys know, and as was demonstrated by the Chiefs and 49ers this year, and has been on display for about the last 3 or 4 years as this league has become more and more of an offensive league, the best way to get a Super Bowl and win it is to have a tier 1, tier 2 quarterback, surround him with good weapons and play calling, and of course, have a good defense. Now, notice I said good, not elite defense. Even the most sarcastic, analytic football nerd types who joke about defense doesn't matter, they're still going to tell you that it's not that defense doesn't matter, it's that offense is way more efficient, it's way more predictable, and that as long as you have a defense that can just get in someone's way, play good situationally, then it's more than good enough. Case in point, the Kansas City Chiefs, who in 2020 made the scheme switch from 3-4, an aggressive attacking scheme, to a much more conservative 4-3 defense. They won the Super Bowl. Now, that's just philosophy. There's actually something else that really backs all of this up, and that's how much easier it is to find the personnel for a 4-3 scheme compared to a 3-4 scheme, hence making it much easier to build up an average defense. Literally every position group in the 4-3 is easier to find in free agency or the draft than in a 3-4 scheme. So let's just go through the groups. And the secondary is the same for both. It's really just the front 7 you're talking about here. So on the interior for a 3-4 team, you need at least one powerful, explosive nose tackle. And in the modern game, you need that nose tackle to not just be 315 plus pounds, but you need him to stop the run, but also be athletic and versatile enough to rush the passer, because that's what matters the most, is your pass rushing ability. Run defense is important, but that's not easy to find. You're talking about Kenny Clark. You're talking about, Fletcher Cox. There's guys that can do that, but they're much harder to find. But then beyond that, you also probably need two athletic, versatile, hybrid defensive ends who can line up anywhere from an inside shade of the guard to head up on the tackle and do a handful of things, from stuff runs, eat blocks, contribute as a pass rusher. So you're talking about three versatile athletic guys. But if you're a 4-3 team, all you need to do is draft really two, or sign or whatever, two well-balanced athletes on the inside who can do a little bit of everything. Not only is it that you only need two of these guys, but you're much less concerned about their size, profile, and their athleticism, as long as they're effective against the run and can find ways to get after the passer. It's not that those guys are easy to find, starting 3 down interior guys, but you're just you got a bigger pool of guys to look at, because you're much less worried about their size and athleticism, more about their production and what kind of traits can you put them in positions to succeed. Whereas in a 3-4, you're much more concerned about their size, their strength, and speed. And then you get to the edge, kind of similar, but amplified. I can't stress enough how much bigger the supply is of defensive ends, edge players, for 4-3 teams compared to 3-4. So a 4-3 end can be anything from a speedy, quick defensive end, a Harold Landry, Von Miller, who's best suited to be a 3-4 outside linebacker but can still play as a 4-3 end, to a 280-pound beast who wins with strength and dominates the run, like Michael Bennett, Arik Armstead. You could look at more athletic types like the Bosas, Rashawn Gary, like those kind of bigger-bodied edge guys that probably wouldn't be best used in a 3-4 scheme. Now, there's ways to work around that and get their hand in the dirt anyway, but then again, you're compromising your scheme and your versatility within it when you do stuff like that. These guys contribute as interior rushers as well, so you have some versatility in a 4-3. In a 3-4, it gets a little more complicated. In a 3-4, you need to find a explosive guy who's got enough length to stop the run but can rush the passer as well. He's got to be quick enough to be able to drop into coverage. He's got to be smart enough to know when and how to do all these things. And he's going to be much smaller. So again, it's nice if and when you can find 3-4 outside linebackers, because they can really kick ass. Khalil Mack, Von Miller, they're 3-4 outside linebackers. But it's a lot harder to find those guys. And if you're just trying to build a modern defense that'll just get in someone's way and literally just not suck ass, it makes way more sense to literally triple the size of the player pool that you get to look at when you're building those edge rush groups. And then the linebackers, I think it gets more amplified as we go here. I think the linebackers is the biggest difference. Because in a 3-4 scheme, the way the D-line is used, most 3-4 teams require that their linebackers are a bit bigger, more capable at your traditional stack, shed, inside run defense. And a lot of that just comes down to the philosophy of a lot of these older defensive coaches. And this comes at the great cost of movement skills and coverage ability, which most of us know is the most important thing for linebackers. So this almost always leads to the overvaluing of guys like Blake Martinez, Avery Williamson, Bernardrick McKinney, Anthony Hitchens, Alec Ogletree, even a guy that I really like but can struggle in coverage playing at 250 pounds, CJ Mosley. These guys are dying breeds in 2020. Anyone that's paying attention knows that coverage is the #1 most important thing for linebackers, because the middle of the field has become the most efficient space and the easiest place on the field to attack. Look at the 49ers offense. It's all about the inside of the field with Kittle and slot wide receivers. They very rarely threw the ball outside, and their offense was unstoppable. Now, some 3-4 teams like the Rams, the Bears, they've started paying attention and started to go smaller and made some adjustments within their schemes. Guys like Corey Littleton, Roquan Smith, some people, some teams, and those happen to be really good defenses, by the way, are catching on. But we all know how stubborn NFL coaches are. And I think it's at least another decade before this age of old, stubborn, traditional 3-4 coaching that is spread out around the league. When it comes to coaching and hiring and philosophy, like that stuff, especially on the defensive side of the ball, a lot of it kind of takes a while to age out. A lot of the young coaches coming in are on the offensive side of the ball. So I think we might reach a point where the 3-4 coaches realize that, you might not need CJ Mosley and Anthony Hitchens, Blake Martinez, but a lot of coaches still think that within their scheme they need that. So that's really the heart of the whole problem. And then as for 4-3 linebackers, again, the supply pool is just much bigger. You can take a guy like Telvin Smith, Deion Jones, or this year's draft, Isaiah Simmons, in a base 4-3, which you're still going to run 30, 35% of the game maybe. You can play them outside the tackles where that size discrepancy isn't going to get as exposed. You don't need them to thump. They're going to be able to use that movement in space better. You don't get that in a 3-4. They're playing between the tackles almost all the time, especially in a base 3-4. And then on passing downs, they can come into the middle of the field. They can dominate those coverage matchups on tight ends, slot receivers, running backs. Traditionally, a lot of 3-4 teams will just stay away from these types of hybrid safety linebacker guys, players, because they get exposed between the tackles sometimes. And I think a lot of it comes back to what we said about coaches just being stubborn. They look at a guy like that and they say, oh, he can't play in our scheme. And this, by the way, really hit me when I was doing my mock draft, and I realized how much the New York Giants could use Isaiah Simmons, but how, Dave Gettleman and his old philosophy, paired with the 3-4 scheme that they run, they're going to undervalue a guy like Isaiah Simmons. And if they did draft him, they would underutilize his skill set between the tackle. Because I, as much as I will say that I think guys like Roquan Smith and what was the other example Corey Littleton, they can play between the tackles. There's only 1 or 2 plays a game where a lineman's going to be able to catch them and bully them. And that's not going to change the shape of a game, especially if you're talking about, okay, the running back got past him and went 5 more yards and the safety made the tackle. For the most part of the course of the season, that's not going to make a huge difference. The problem is these coaches don't realize that, and they think they need those extra 15 pounds on these linebackers so that they might shed that block instead. So when I look at the Giants, they might pass up on Isaiah Simmons. They might draft him and then, stick him inside, and we'll see. He only played like 8% of his snaps at Clemson between the tackles. If he was in a 4-3 scheme, he'd be outside a little more. He'd be matched up on tight ends. He'd be controlling outside zones a little more than thumping between the tackles. So that's kind of the difference there. And the last point I'll make here is, there's great examples of guys like Darius Leonard, Bobby Okereke, Fred Warner. They've come in with 4-3 teams, and I promise you, 3-4 teams would have had these guys lower on their draft boards because they wouldn't have been viewed so much as 3-down players like they are in a 4-3 scheme. Because you can play them at a weak side linebacker in a 4-3. When you go base in a 3-4, you don't really have room for a Fred Warner who might get blasted between the tackles, at least in a lot of these old coaches' minds. I think he could be just fine if a lot of these guys would open up to that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what I'm saying here. So this got really long, but just to summarize like a 180-character tweet or something, 3-4 defense, they can still be great. And when done well, are often better than 4-3 defenses. But they're much, much harder to build. The modern game is about playing great offense and good defense. And in a 4-3 scheme, it's schematically easier to have a good defense because it's more conservative. Assignments are easier, less versatility, keep everything in front of you, bend, don't break. But it's also easier to find quality players at each position in a 4-3 defense, which, perhaps most importantly, allows you to push those guys back a few extra rounds, spend a little less money in free agency on those guys, and invest more on the offensive side of the ball to help out that quarterback and get that offense as good as possible. So I'm not saying that coaches should ban 3-4 defenses entirely. I think there's still room for it. But honestly, really only for teams that either have established cultures with that system, like Baltimore, New England. They've got elite coaches, confident in their ability to kind of build up those defenses. Or maybe a team like, Denver, teams that may not be set up to have a top 10 offense, or you don't know how that quarterback's going to be. And they realize that if they're going to win a Super Bowl, they're going to need elite defense to do it, and they got to go all out for that defense. That's perfectly fine. If that's an approach that can win Super Bowls, it's just harder to do. Injuries hurt you more. It's less likely. It's less predictable. But that can be an approach that still works. If you don't have that quarterback, you got to do what you got to do, right? So if that's your situation, that's fine. Run a 3-4 team. You also would want your coach to be comfortable with that 3-4 also, as opposed to a 4-3, because there's teams like Jacksonville that are 4-3 teams that have had great defenses with bad quarterback play. But at the end of the day, this is a trend that I think is much more, like the NFL is catching up to this much more. Teams like the Colts, the Chiefs, two of the most modern thinking teams in the league have made this switch and gone from historically awful defenses to really solid bend-don't-break teams almost overnight. And a lot of the NFL has been catching up to this, making the move from 4-3, making the move from 3-4 to 4-3 over the last few years. I think right now, like 2/3 of the league runs 4-3, and I think all of the reasons I said in this video are why. So I hope you found this at least educational. I'm really glad to just kind of dump this down for the record and explain why I think in most situations a 4-3 scheme is the better way to go in 2020. So we're going to get back to the rest of the podcast here. This is going to wrap up that YouTube video. Hit that like button if you're watching this on YouTube, and let's continue on the podcast.